The sky stopped being true at the edge of the Anvesh hospice ring, and the first thing the dying noticed was that their pain stopped meaning anything. Sail Toval knew it before the alarms did. He was a field medic, 3rd grade, 11 years on the long wards, and he had learned to read a patient the way other people read instruments. He had 300 of them on the outer ring that morning, old soldiers and burned colonists and small ones too young to have a rank yet, all of them brought to Anvesh because it was the quietest place in the Tarath Reach, a place to mend or a place to finish gently. Sel moved between the beds with a feeding line in one hand, and he felt the floor go wrong under his feet. It was not a shake he would have understood. This was the opposite of a shake. It was the floor becoming more certain of itself than it had any right to be, as if the metal had decided it was the only real thing in the room, and everything else was a rumor. Sel set down the line. He looked at the water in a patient's cup and saw it lying perfectly flat, too flat, flatter than water knows how to be. Then a child 2 beds down asked him why her heartbeat had gone quiet, and Sel put his hand to her chest and felt nothing, and felt her warm and breathing and looking up at him all the same. He had no word for it yet. The word would come later, from the humans, and it would be a small word. For now he only knew that the law of the place had changed, and that he was a healer standing inside a wound that had been cut into the rules instead of into flesh. The station mind spoke over the wards in its soft keeper's voice. It told them the lapse had reached the 3rd marker. It told them to remain calm. Sel had heard that voice say a great many true things over the years, and he noticed that for the first time it sounded as if it did not believe itself. Anvesh had been built for this and only this. It was a ring of gray wards turning slowly around a small cold sun on the very rim of the Tarath Reach, deliberately far from anything worth taking, deliberately quiet, a place chosen because the soft dark had no reason to want it, and so might leave it alone the longest. 30,000 souls had passed through its wards in the years Sail had worked them, and most of them had come not to be cured but to be kept, to spend their last weeks somewhere the rules still held, and the water in the cup still moved. The whole station was an act of stubbornness dressed up as a hospital. It said, in its slow gray turning, that even at the edge of a galaxy being unwritten, there ought to be one place where a frightened person could lie down and trust the floor. Sail had given 11 years to that stubbornness. He had a small room with a narrow bed and a window the size of his hand, and a record slate full of names he had sat beside at the end, and almost nothing else, because almost nothing else had ever seemed worth keeping. He was not a brave person by his own reckoning. Brave people went toward the soft dark. Sail stayed behind it, doing the small work, the feeding lines and the cool cloths and the steady voice, and he had made a long quiet life out of being the one who did not run, which was the only kind of courage he had ever trusted, because it asked nothing of you but that you stay. He went to the long window at the end of the ward, because the dying liked him to tell them what the stars were doing, and he looked out, and the stars were doing nothing at all. That was the horror of it. Not fire, not a fleet, not teeth in the dark. The stars beyond the ring had simply stopped. They did not flicker. They did not move. The whole field of them hung there like paint that had been told it was finished, and across that frozen sky a shape was coming, and the shape was the only thing in the universe that still seemed to know how to move. Sail had seen a great many frightening things in 11 years on the long wards. He had seen what the predator ships of the IS did to a colony, and what a hull breach does to a child, and what 2 years of dying does to the face of a soldier who used to be proud. None of it had ever frightened him the way the still stars frightened him now, and it took him a moment, standing at the window with his hand flat on the cold glass, to understand why. Every horror he had ever treated had at least been a thing that happened inside the rules. A wound bled because blood was a rule. A burned body hurt because pain was a rule. The rules were terrible, sometimes, but they were also the only ground a healer had to stand on. The floor under the work, the promise that a cool cloth would cool, and a steady hand would steady. The stopped stars were a horror underneath all of that. They were the floor itself going soft. They were the thing that took away not your life, but the rules that made your life mean anything, and against that, Sail knew, no cloth and no hand and no steadiness had ever been enough, because steadiness needs a floor to stand on, and the floor was exactly what the soft dark came to take. He had built his whole quiet courage on the floor holding. He watched it stop holding, out beyond the glass, and felt the small, cold knowledge settle in him that this time there would be nothing to carry the patience to. Sail had been a child himself when the first reports came in from the Vorn worlds, 9 of them, gone in a season, not destroyed. The word the survivors used was unwritten. The thing that did it had no fleet, and no face, and no demand. It simply arrived at the edge of a system, and the rules of that system began to soften, and where the rules went soft, the people went still, and then the system was a place where light no longer agreed to travel, and time no longer agreed to pass, and the dead and the living were no longer two different conditions. The Reach had 100 names for it. The oldest and the truest was the unwritten. It did not come to conquer, because conquering is a thing you do to people you still believe are real. It came the way a tide comes to a sandcastle, with no malice and no mercy and no hurry at all, and in 900 years of records, nothing had ever made it pause. Sail Toval was a medic. He had never held a weapon. He had spent his whole life on the wrong side of every battle, arriving after the shooting, carrying the ones who could be carried, sitting with the ones who could not. He understood better than any admiral in the Reach what the unwritten really was, because he had watched it do its work on a single patient once, a fold pilot brought in too late, and he had sat by that bed and watched a living person slowly stop being subject to the rules that make a person, until there was a body in front of him that was warm and was not, that breathed and did not need to, that looked at him with eyes that had forgotten what looking was for. He had not slept right since, and now the thing that did that to one man was 3 markers out from a ring full of people he had promised to keep. So when the keeper mind said, in its careful voice, that a fleet had been dispatched, Sail Toval did not feel hope. He felt the particular grief of a man who has watched fleets dispatched before. The Tereth Sodality sent 400 warships into the first laps at Vorn. The warships arrived. Their weapons would not light, because the law that lets a weapon light had been edited out of the local sky. Their engines would not push, because push had become a suggestion the universe was free to decline. The 400 ships drifted into the soft place and went still, and were added to the great frozen still life that the unwritten left behind it, everywhere it had ever been, and the Sodality learned the only lesson the unwritten ever taught, which was that you cannot fight a thing that erases the meaning of fighting. After that, the Reach stopped sending fleets. It started sending hospices instead, places like Vesh, built at a careful distance, so that when a world was about to be unwritten, there would be somewhere to carry the few you could pull out in time. Sail's whole profession was an admission of defeat. He was the bandage the galaxy kept, because it had given up on the wound. He had read the old Sodality accounts, once, on a long night shift, all 400 ships of them. They were not exciting reading. They were the worst kind of record, because nothing happened in them. The cruisers crossed the soft edge in good order. The captains reported their weapons would not light, in calm voices, because there had not yet been any reason to panic. Then the reports got shorter. Then they got strange, the captains describing the inside of their own ships as if from far away, the distances on their bridges no longer adding up, the time between their own words stretching. Then the reports stopped, not in fear, but mid-sentence, the way a person stops talking when they have simply forgotten they were speaking. The last transmission in the whole archive was a single junior officer, somewhere deep in the soft place, asking, very quietly, whether anyone else could still feel their hands. No one answered. The archive ended there. The 400 ships were still out there, frozen at the edge of the first Vorn system, and the Reach had charted them as a navigational hazard and learned, very thoroughly, to stay away. That was the file Sail carried in him as he stood at his window. That was what the soft dark did. It did not roar in. It crept, and it was polite, and it took your weapons and then your distances and then your hands, and the last thing it took was the part of you that would have minded. The Reach had no defense against that. No one did. You could not armor a sky. So the Reach had built Sail instead, and 30,000 others like him on 100 quiet rings, and called it the best they could do, which it was. He was the bandage the galaxy kept, because it had given up on the wound. He looked at the frozen stars and the single moving shape, and he prepared, with the steady hands of a man who had done this too many times, to do the only thing his people had left, to gather who he could, to make them comfortable, to stay. Then the Keeper Mind said something Sail had never heard it say in 11 years. It said the moving shape was not the unwritten. It said the moving shape had answered the distress band on a channel 900 years out of use, in a voice the archive could barely parse, and that the voice had said only this: in the old trade tongue of a people the Reach had counted as dead since before the hospice ring was built. Hold your patience. We have the helm. And the Keeper Mind, which had never in Cell's hearing expressed an opinion, added one word of its own, quietly, as if to itself. Humans. Cell had not known there were still humans. No one in the Reach did, not really. They were a fact from the deep past, filed under the same heading as the Great Extinctions. A young, loud people from a far arm of stars, who had built and warred and grown frightening for a few bright centuries, and then gone quiet, and the Reach had assumed quiet meant ended, the way the young always assume that anything they stop hearing about has died. There were old stories, of course. There were always old stories. The humans were the ones in the stories who did not run from the unwritten. The humans were the ones who, the stories said, had built a ship to argue with the sky. Cell had treated those stories the way he treated the cup of water on his ward, as something flat that ought not to be trusted. He believed in what he could carry and what he could mend. He did not believe in a ship that argued with the sky. He pressed himself to the long window and watched it come. It came across the frozen field of stars slowly, and it was not large. That was the first thing wrong with it, measured against the stories. Cell had imagined, on the nights he let himself imagine, something enormous, a wall of a thing, a fortress that matched the size of the threat. The ship that crossed the dead sky toward Anvesh was 900 meters from end to end. A picket, a patrol hull, smaller than the Sodality cruisers that had drifted uselessly into the first laps and never come out. It was the matte gray of unpolished stone, with no lights along its flanks, no banner, no painted name, and it moved through the stillness of the unwritten's edge the way a single steady hand moves through a crowd of the frightened, without hurry and without doubt. And it was plain. That was the third wrong thing, and it troubled Cell more than the size. Every warship he had ever seen wanted to be seen. They wore their guns on the outside. They carried the marks of their kills, the way the Predator ships of the IS carried theirs, the way the Sodality cruisers had carried banners the length of a corridor. A warship, in Sail's whole experience, was a kind of shout, a thing built to frighten you before it ever fired, because frightening you was half its work. The gray ship was the opposite of a shout. It had nothing on its outside at all. No port, no muzzle, no seam, no boast, just 900 meters of unbroken stone-gray hull that told you nothing about what it could do. And Cell found, looking at it, that the not telling was more frightening than any banner, because a thing that does not need to frighten you is a thing that knows it does not need to. The deadliest creatures Cell had ever treated the victims of were never the loud ones. The loud ones were afraid, the quiet ones were certain. The gray ship was the quietest thing he had ever seen, and it moved. That was the second thing, and it took Cell a moment to understand why it made the breath catch in his throat. Everything else out there had stopped. The lapse had reached 3 markers, and inside its growing reach, the universe had been edited down to a held image. The stars pinned, the dust suspended, the very light loitering in place because the rule that tells light to travel had been quietly deleted. Nothing inside that region was permitted to move. The gray ship moved anyway. It crossed the frozen edge of the lapse the way a swimmer crosses the line between deep water and shallow, and Cell saw the boundary bend around it. Not break, bend. As if the new soft law of the place reached out to revise the ship the way it had revised 400 warships, to tell it that motion was no longer required of it, and as if the ship simply declined. The water in the patient's cup, which had been lying that terrible flat, trembled. One small ripple crossed it. The first honest thing the water had done in an hour. Sale found he had pressed his hand flat against the cold window. Behind him 100 patients had gone silent in their beds, the way the very ill go silent when something larger than their illness comes into the room. The keeper mind opened the band so the wards could hear, because the keeper mind had decided, in the way of all of them at Vesh, that the dying had a right to know what was deciding their fate. And across that channel came the human voice again, no longer in the broken old trade tongue, but rendering itself patiently into the reach speech, learning the grammar as it spoke, the way you might learn the layout of a stranger's home by walking carefully through it in the dark. The keeper mind, which had spent the whole afternoon being calm because that was its purpose, allowed itself one observation that was not calm at all. It said the gray ship did not register on most of its instruments. Not because it was hidden, the keeper mind said, but because the instruments did not know how to describe it. An instrument measures a thing by the rules the thing obeys, by its mass and its heat and the way it bends the field around it, and the gray ship, the keeper mind reported, appeared to obey the rules only as a courtesy, the way a grown person follows the small games of a child, going along with them because it is kind to and not because it must. The sensors gave readings and then revised them and then gave up, and the keeper mind said, in a voice Sale had never heard it use, that it had been measuring ships for 60 years and had never met one that it could not measure, and that the experience was not unlike meeting, for the first time, something that was simply older than the question your instruments were built to ask. The voice did not announce itself as a god. Sale noticed that, and it stayed with him for the rest of his long life. The stories had said the humans built a thing to argue with the sky, and Sale had expected a god's voice, vast and cold. Instead, the voice that came across the band sounded tired and careful and kind, the voice of someone who had done a hard thing many times and was about to do it again. It said its name was the Keystone of Aldrin. It said it was sorry it was late. Then it asked Sale Toval a question, by name, because it had read the ward registry in the time it took to cross a frozen sky, and the question was the question of a physician, not a warrior. It asked him how many of his patients could not be moved. Sale told it. 40. 40 too fragile to survive a transfer. 40 who would die in the handling. 40 he had already privately moved into the column in his mind that was reserved for the ones you stay with, rather than the ones you save. He told the ship that number, with the flat steadiness of a man who has made his peace with arithmetic. The Keystone of Aldrin was quiet for the length of a breath, and then it said a thing that Sel had been waiting 11 years to hear someone say, that he had stopped believing anyone in the universe still believed. It said, "Then we will hold the sky still until they can be moved safely. Take all the time you need." Sel did not understand. No one understood the Keystone, not really, not for a long time, and the not understanding is the whole heart of what happened at Vesh, so it is worth being patient with it. The unwritten was not a fleet you could shoot. It was the local death of law. It did not advance the way an army advances. It advanced the way cold advances into a body, by the quiet edits of physics, deleting the rules of a region one by one. First it deleted distance, so that the far parts of a system folded into the near and nothing could be navigated. Then it deleted force, so that nothing could push or pull or strike. Then it deleted time, the slow softening that turned the living into the held, the breathing into the suspended, the 400 sodality cruisers into the frozen sculpture garden they remain to this day. There was no front line to defend. There was no enemy ship to face. There was only a place where the universe was being unwritten, and a growing edge to that place, and on the wrong side of that edge, 300 patients and one medic who would not leave them. You could not hold the sky still. The sky was not yours to hold. That was the lesson 900 years had taught the Reach. Sel had believed that lesson more deeply than most, because he had been the one to carry the bodies that proved it. He had stood at 100 bedsides and watched the soft dark take people, and the one mercy he had been able to offer was honesty. He had never told a dying patient that the universe could be argued with. He had told them, instead, that the rules were the rules, and that the kind thing, the only thing, was to be comfortable inside them while they held. He had built his whole gentleness on the certainty that you cannot hold the sky still, and now a voice from the deep past was telling 40 of his patients to take all the time they needed, and Sel did not know whether to call it the cruelest false hope he had ever heard, or the first true one. The humans, it turned out, had spent those same 900 years respectfully disagreeing. Sale went back to his patients, because that was his work, and his work did not stop for miracles. He began the slow triage of moving the ones who could be moved, calling the inner wards, organizing the litters, doing with his hands the small necessary things while his mind tried and failed to make sense of the gray ship now holding position at the very lip of the lapse. 900 meters of unpolished stone, sitting at the edge of a region that erased everything that entered it, sitting there the way a person sits down calmly in a doorway that is on fire, as if the fire were a matter on which the person intended to have an opinion. The keeper mind, which had access to instruments Sel did not, began describing what it saw, in the flat, astonished tone of a thing reporting figures it does not believe. It said the keystone of Aldrin was not generating a field. It said that was the part it could not explain. Every defense the Reach had ever built against anything was a field, a wall of force pushed out from a generator, and a field was exactly the kind of thing the unwritten ate first, because a field is a rule you impose on the local sky, and the unwritten's entire nature was the unimposing of rules. 400 sodality cruisers had died with their shields up. Their shields were the first thing to go. The Keystone had no shield up. The Keystone, the Keeper Mind reported, was not pushing anything outward at all. It was, instead, simply refusing to be edited. Sel, carrying the foot of a litter with a burned colonist on it, did not follow the physics and never fully would, but he understood the shape of it the way a healer understands a thing, by analogy to a body. He thought of a fever. He thought of how a fever is the body's law breaking down, the careful rules of temperature and rhythm dissolving into chaos, and how you do not fight a fever by shouting at it or by building a wall against it. You hold the patient. You keep the one steady thing, the cool cloth, the steady hand, the unchanging voice, and you let the steadiness be a place the body can find its way back to. You do not impose order. You remain orderly, in the middle of the disorder, and you wait, and you let the wrongness exhaust itself against the one thing it cannot make wrong. The humans, Sel would learn, had built exactly that, not a wall against the unwriting, a thing that could not be unwritten, a fixed point, a written constant in a universe of soft pencil. They had looked at a force that erased the rules, and instead of building a bigger gun, which was the only idea the rest of the galaxy had ever had, they had asked a stranger question. They had asked what a rule was made of, and whether you could make something so true that the truth could not be revised, and they had spent the long centuries of their silence not dying, as everyone assumed, but learning the answer. The Keystone of Aldrin was the answer. It was 900 meters of stone-gray hull that the universe was no longer able to disagree with. The lapse reached the second marker, and at the second marker the soft place tried to take the hospice ring itself. Sale felt it as a loosening in his own chest, a horrible familiar wrongness, the rule of his own heartbeat going optional, the same softening he had watched take the Fold pilot 11 years before. Around him the patients on their litters made small sounds of fear, and the Keeper Mind's voice thinned, and the floor that had been too certain began to become uncertain instead, every surface in the ward flickering between solid and suggestion. A nurse near the door simply stopped, mid-step, 1 foot raised, and hung there, caught in the act of moving, neither fallen nor standing, and Sel could not reach her in time and knew it. And then the wrongness stopped at the threshold of the ward, as if it had struck a wall, and rolled back, and the nurse's raised foot came down, and she gasped, and the floor remembered how to be a floor. Because the keystone had moved. It had crossed from the lip of the lapse to the hospice ring in a span of time that the Keeper Mind reported, and then reported again because it did not trust the first number, and it had placed its 900 meters of unrewritable hull between the soft place and the wards, and where it stood, the law came back. Not pushed back, came back. The way warmth comes back into a frozen hand when you hold it, slow and aching and true, the rules of the local sky finding the one fixed point and remembering themselves by reference to it. Distance worked again in the shadow of the keystone. Force worked again. Time, blessed and ordinary time, resumed its forward walk, and the held nurse breathed, and the flat water in the cup learned how to be water. Sail Toval stood in the middle of his ward with a litter's weight in his hands and looked through the long window at the gray ship that had decided to argue with the sky on his behalf. And he understood, with the whole of himself, that he had been wrong about everything he had let himself believe for 11 years. He had believed the universe was a thing that happened to you, that law was weather, that when the rules came to soften you, the only dignity left was to stay with the ones you loved while it happened. His entire profession, the whole quiet brave hospice of the Reach, had been built on the certainty that you could not hold the sky still. And 900 meters of stone-gray patience had just held it still, over his ward, for him, because he had told it 40 of his people could not be moved, and it had decided that the universe could wait. The human voice came across the band again, and it was still tired, and still kind, and it said, "You have until the law is steady. Move whom you can. We will keep the rest of the sky in place." Sail moved them. All afternoon, if afternoon meant anything anymore, he and the nurses and the Keepermind's small attending drones ferried the living from the outer ring to the inner wards, across a station that should by every law of the unwritten have been a frozen sculpture by now, and was instead merely a hospice having a very long and frightening day. The keystone held its place at the edge of the soft region, and the soft region pressed against it, and the Keepermind reported the pressing in numbers that climbed and climbed, the unwritten bringing more and more of its nature to bear on the one thing in the universe it could not revise, the way you might lean harder and harder against a door that simply will not move. And the door did not move. That was the thing none of them could stop watching. The unwritten had erased the laws of 900 worlds. It had folded 400 warships into stillness without effort. It had taught a whole arm of the galaxy that resistance was a category error. And it leaned its whole vast soft weight against 900 meters of gray stone, and the gray stone simply continued to be true. Twice during that long ferrying the soft dark surged, and twice the Keepermind cried a warning, and twice the floor began to forget itself under the running medics. And both times, before Sel could even reach the patient nearest him, the gray ship shifted its place by some small amount, a few hundred meters along the rim of the lapse, and the surge broke against it and rolled away. Sel came to understand, watching, that the keystone was not holding one line. It was reading the soft dark the way Sel read a patient, watching for where the wrongness would push next, and putting itself there first, so that every place the unwriting reached for, it found the one fixed point already waiting. The ship moved the way a good nurse moves through a crowded ward in a crisis. Always already where the trouble is about to be, never hurried, never anywhere by accident. Sel had not known a warship could move like a nurse. He had not known, until that afternoon, that those were the same skill wearing different clothes. The old soldier on the litter Sel carried, the one who had waited 2 years to die in peace, watched the gray ship through the transfer corridor window and said, in the cracked dry voice of the very ill, that in 60 years of war he had seen every kind of warship there was, and that he had never once seen one that looked like it was being careful not to frighten anybody. Sale told him that was the strangest thing about it, and the old soldier laughed, which cost him, and said no, the strangest thing was that it was working. Sale carried the last litter through the inner doors as the Keepermind announced that all movable patients were clear. 40 remained, the 40 too fragile to move, the 40 he had marked in his mind for staying. He went back out to them, alone, because that was the work, and he sat down among them in the outer ward with the soft place pressing against the window and the gray ship holding the line, and he did the thing he knew how to do. He went from bed to bed. He held the ones who were afraid. He told them what the stars were doing, and for the first time in 11 years, what the stars were doing was coming back. The keeper mind let Sehel listen to the keystone after that, because Sehel asked, and because the dying have a way of getting what they ask for at Anvesh. So the medic sat among his 40 fragile patients, with a feeding line in one hand and a channel open in his ear, and he listened to a human warship work, and what he heard was not what 900 years of stories had prepared him for. The stories were all thunder. The reality was a quiet conversation between a ship and the end of all rules, and the ship was winning the argument by being more patient than the thing that had outlasted civilizations. He learned, listening, that the keystone of Aldrin was not alone in the deep past. It was the last of a line. There had been 40 of them once. 40 keystone hulls, built by humanity in the bright, frightened centuries before its silence, when the unwritten had first come into the human arm of stars and begun to soften the rules of the worlds where the human children lived. The humans had done what the Reach had done. At first, they had sent fleets. The fleets had drifted into the soft places and become still, and the humans had stood at their windows and watched their warships turn into sculpture, exactly as the sodality had, exactly as everyone always did. And then, the channel told Cell, in the patient learned by listening voice of the ship, the humans had done the thing that no one else had done. They had stopped asking how to hurt the unwritten. They had asked, instead, what they would have to become in order to not be hurt by it. It was the hardest question their makers had ever set themselves. To answer it, they had to learn what a physical law actually was. Down at the floor of things, below force and field and weapon, down where the universe keeps the small handful of rules it never breaks. And below all of it they found the thing the unwritten could not touch, because the unwritten worked by revising rules, and there is one thing in the universe that cannot be revised, which is a truth that is true by its own nature, a constant that does not depend on permission. The humans learned to build with that. They learned to make a hull not out of metal that obeyed the local law, but out of the kind of truth that the local law has to obey. They built 40 ships that were, in the deepest sense, simply correct, and a correct thing cannot be told it is wrong, not by a fleet, not by a god, not by the slow, soft death of all rules. 39 of those ships were gone now. Cell learned that too, and the way the keystone said it stayed with him. They had not been destroyed. You cannot destroy a constant. They had been spent. Each one, across 900 years, had gone to a world the unwritten was unwriting, and had set itself down at the edge of the soft place, and had held the sky still over that world until the law came back and stayed back, and the holding cost. To remain a fixed point while the entire weight of unbeing leaned against you, to be the one true thing in a region where truth was being deleted, was a labor that used the ship up, slowly, the way a stone in a river is used up by being the thing the water has to go around. 39 keystones had held their lines until the law was steady and the people were safe, and then, their work complete, they had gone still themselves, willingly, finally, fixed points that became fixed monuments, standing forever at the edges of the worlds they had saved. The keystone of Aldrin was the 40th, the last. There were no more being built, because the people who built them had long since chosen their own silence, and Cell never fully learned why, only that the humans had decided, in their long quiet, that they would spend their last great ships, not on saving themselves, but on answering distress bands 900 years out of use, in the speech of peoples they had never met, who had counted them dead. It told Cell about the ones it had saved, when he asked, because the dying liked to hear the names of things, and the medic had spent his life learning that the way you comfort the frightened is to give them a story larger than their fear. It named worlds Sale had never heard of, in an arm of stars no reach chart reached, worlds where the soft dark had come, and a keystone had set itself down at the edge and held the sky until the people behind it could breathe again. It named the world of Aldrin itself, the world the ship was named for, the first it had ever saved, 900 years gone, a green place with 2 small moons where a frightened people had watched their stars freeze, and then watched them move again because a gray ship had decided the freezing was unacceptable. The ship spoke of Aldrin the way a person speaks of a child they raised, with a tenderness that did not fit the size of the thing, and Cell realized that the ship remembered every world it had ever stood over, remembered them by name, carried them, the way Cell carried his record slate of names, the way every true healer carries the ones they could not keep along with the ones they could. It told him, too, about the ones it had not reached in time. It did not hide them. There were worlds the Keystones had come to too late, where the soft dark had finished its work before a gray ship arrived, and the ship spoke of those with a grief that Cell knew from the inside, the particular grief of the one whose job is to come, who comes as fast as a thing can come, and still arrives after. The Keystone of Aldrin had been late before. It had crossed gulfs at the very edge of what it was, and still found, at the end of the crossing, a world already gone still, a sky already frozen, a people already past saving. It carried those too. And Cell, who had spent 11 years being the one who arrives after the battle, understood then that he and the gray ship outside his window were, at the bottom of things, the same kind of creature, and that the most frightening warship in the galaxy had built its entire long life around a grief that Cell had thought belonged only to medics. It came when called. That was all. The Keystone of Aldrin had heard a hospice ring at the edge of the Terith Reach put out the old wide distress signal as the unwritten reached its third marker, and it had come, the last of its line, across a gulf no chart still held, to hold one more sky still for one more frightened people, because that was the only thing left in the universe its makers had wanted it to do. There was a thing the Keystone said in the middle of all that, telling that Cell turned over for the rest of his life. He had asked it, in the foolish, honest way the very tired ask things, whether it was afraid. Whether a ship that had watched 39 of its own kind go still, one by one, across 900 years, knowing it was the last, knowing that its own work would one day use it up the same way, was afraid of the going still. And the Keystone had answered, after a moment, that it had been built without the part that is afraid, because its makers had decided, long ago, that a thing asked to hold the sky still over the frightened should not itself be frightened, that fear was a tremor and a fixed point must not tremble. And then it had said, more quietly, that it had learned something its makers had not given it, in 900 years of standing over dying worlds, which was that the absence of fear is not the same as not caring, that it had no fear of its own ending, and grieved every ending it had failed to prevent, and that it had come to think this was the right way for a thing of its kind to be made, unafraid for itself, grieving for everyone else. Cell thought that was as good a description of a healer as he had ever heard, and he was a healer, and it had taken a warship to say it plainly. Cell Toval sat among his 40 and wept, quietly, in the way of a man who has spent his life being the steady one, and is permitted, just this once, to not be. The keeper mind, listening with Cell, said a thing then in its careful voice that Cell never forgot. It said that in all its records of the long war against the soft dark, every defender had eventually been used up, and that it had assumed, watching the gray ship hold its line, that the Keystone of Aldrin was simply the slowest to be used up, the most patient of a doomed kind. But the more it listened to the ship speak of its lost brothers, the more the keeper mind began to suspect that the 39 had not been beaten at all. They had been spent the way a coin is spent, deliberately, each one trading the whole of itself for a world. They had chosen it. A Keystone could have stood at the edge of a soft place and simply held, indefinitely, refusing to spend itself, keeping itself whole, and letting the world behind it take its chances. Not one of them had. Every one of the 39 had poured the whole of what it was into the holding, had pushed past the point of safety and into the point of cost, because a half-held sky was not good enough, because the people behind it were real and the price was only a ship. The keeper mind said that it had been measuring the wrong thing. It had been counting the dead Keystones as losses. They were not losses. They were the most expensive gifts ever given, and each one had been given on purpose, by a thing that felt no fear for itself and grief for everyone else. And Cell, hearing this, put his hand over his eyes, because it was his whole profession described in the life of a warship, and he had never once heard anyone outside a hospice understand it. Out at the edge of the lapse, the unwritten stopped leaning, and began, for the first time in 900 years of records, to think. The keeper mind reported the change with something close to fear, because a thing that had never paused was pausing. The soft region around the keystone, which had been pressing in with steadily climbing force, eased. The numbers fell, and then they did something the keeper mind had no procedure for. They went sideways. The unwritten, unable to revise the fixed point, did the only other thing its nature allowed. It tried to revise everything else more. The whole region beyond the keystone deepened. The frozen sky stopped being merely frozen and began to come apart. The stars beyond the soft edge not just held now but unwriting. Light forgetting how to be light. The held 400 sodality cruisers in the distance beginning, the keeper mind reported in a voice gone thin, to dissolve, their long still hulls finally being taken down past stillness into nothing at all. The unwritten had decided that if it could not edit the one fixed point, it would edit the universe around it, so completely that the fixed point would have nothing left to be correct about. It would unwrite the floor itself, and let the keystone stand correct, and alone, in a region where correctness had no referent, a true thing pointing at a sky that no longer existed. It was, the keeper mind said quietly, very old and very patient, and it had clearly done this before. And Sel Toval, the medic, the non-fighter, the man who arrived after every battle, found that he understood the unwritten now, here at the end, in a way the admirals never had. Because he had seen this too. He had seen it at deathbeds. He had seen the thing that comes for a patient when the patient cannot be killed outright, the slow taking away of everything around the one stubborn light until the light has nothing left to hold to. He had sat with people whom the universe was patiently editing out of the world, one rule at a time, and he had learned the only thing a healer can do against a patient force that has all the time there is. You give the light a referent, you become the thing it can point at. You hold its hand, and you say, here, I am here, the world is still here, you are still in it, and you do not let go even when the room itself begins to forget what a room is for. He thought of the Fold pilot again, the one from 11 years ago, the one whose bedside had broken something in him that had never quite mended. He had been young then, newly 3rd grade, and they had brought the pilot in from a ship that had skimmed too close to a soft borderland, and the pilot had been awake and talking and afraid, and Sel had sat with him through the long night, while the rules let go of the man one at a time. First the pain went, which the pilot was glad of, and which terrified Sel, because pain is a rule. Pain is the body insisting on itself, and a body that stops insisting is a body the dark has begun to win. Then the heartbeat went quiet under Sel's hand, while the man kept breathing. Then the distances on the man's face stopped adding up, the way the sodality captains had described their bridges, and the pilot looked at Sel from very far away, though he was an arm's length off, and asked, in a voice already half unwritten, whether Sel could still feel his hands. And Sel, who had read the sodality archive, had known then exactly what was coming, and had not been able to stop a single rule of it, and had simply held the man's hand and said, I am here, the world is still here, until the man stopped being a thing the words could reach. He had stayed all night, he had not let go. And it had not been enough, because one steady hand against the whole soft dark is never enough, and Sel had carried the failure of it for 11 years, the proof at the center of him that you cannot hold the sky still. He understood now that he had been right about the failure and wrong about the lesson. One hand was not enough, but the answer to one hand not being enough was never to stop holding. The answer was more hands. The answer was a room so thick with steadiness that the dark could not unwrite it faster than the room insisted. He had not had that room, 11 years ago, for one frightened pilot. The keystone of Aldrin had it now, for a whole sky, and did not yet know it. You become the thing the light can point at, and if becoming the only such thing is not enough, then you do the harder thing. You teach everything around you to be such a thing too. Sel opened the channel, his voice shaking, and he spoke to the keystone of Aldrin, and he told it what he had learned at 1,000 deathbeds, which was the one thing 900 years of human engineering had perhaps never thought to consider. He told it that it did not have to be the only fixed point. The ship was quiet. When it answered, the tired, kind voice had changed, very slightly, the way a voice changes when it has heard something it did not expect to hear. It asked Sail what he meant. And Sail Toval, who had never held a weapon, who had spent 11 years carrying the dying out of the path of a thing he believed could not be stopped, told a human warship how to win. He said the unwritten was not trying to destroy the keystone. It had given that up. It was trying to make the keystone meaningless, by unwriting everything the ship's correctness referred to. A fixed point is only fixed in relation to other things. Hold one true point in a sky that is being erased, and eventually the sky has nothing left, and the true point is true about nothing. But, Sel said, that is also how you save a dying patient. Not with one steady hand, with a room full of them. You do not hold the patient against the dark alone. You fill the room with steady things, the cool cloth, the familiar voice, the unchanging light, the held hand, until there are so many true things around the patient that the dark cannot unwrite faster than the room insists. You make the world too thick with steadiness to erase. The keystone, Sel said, was trying to be the one fixed point in a sky that was coming apart. And it would lose that way. Not the battle. The ship would never lose the battle, but it would lose the sky. It would stand correct forever over a region of nothing, the way 39 of its kind stood correct forever over the worlds they had saved, a monument to a victory that cost the world it was meant to save, unless it stopped trying to be the only true thing, and gave its correctness away. The keystone of Aldrin was silent for 9 seconds, and in those 9 seconds, Sel Toval believed he had said something foolish to a thing 900 years wiser than himself. Then the ship said, in a voice that had lost the last of its tiredness, "No one has ever told us that before." It explained, quickly now, the careful learned grammar falling away into something almost eager, what Sel had not known he was describing. The keystone was a fixed point, because its hull was built from a constant, a single truth that could not be revised. For 900 years, across 40 ships, the humans had used that, the only way they had ever imagined using it, to stand, to hold a line, to be the one thing the dark could not move, so that the law would find it and remember itself by reference to it, and the people behind it would live. It had never once occurred to them, the ship admitted, that a constant could be shared. That was the human limit, and Sel found it strangely moving, here at the end, that the most frightening builders the galaxy had ever produced had a limit at all. They had built ships that could not be unwritten, and they had used them as shields, as anchors, as monuments. They had thought of the constant as something to be, a property of a single proud hull standing alone against the sky. They had never thought of it as something to give, the way a healer gives steadiness to a room, not by being the only steady thing, but by teaching the whole room how to be steady. The keystone of Aldrin told Sel Toval that it was going to try something it had never done in 900 years, and that it might be the last thing it ever did, and that it had Sel to thank either way. Then it began to give the sky its correctness. Sel watched it through the long window, and the keeper mind narrated it in numbers it could not believe, and neither of them ever fully understood the mechanism, and it does not matter, because the shape of it was the shape Sel knew from 1,000 deathbeds, and that is the part worth telling. The keystone stopped being the only fixed point. It reached out, not with force, never with force. Force was the one tool it had always refused, but with reference. It took the single true constant that its hull was made of, the truth that could not be revised, and it began to write that truth onto everything around it, onto the dust, onto the stilled light, onto the dissolving hulls of the 400 sodality cruisers, onto the hospice ring and the long window and the cup of water and the 40 fragile patients and the one weeping medic. It made them all, briefly, correct. It made them all, for a span of time, things that could not be told they were wrong. Sel felt it happen to himself. That was the part he could never make anyone fully understand afterward, because there were no words for the inside of it. He was sitting among his 40 patients with the channel open in his ear, and the wrongness that had been pressing at the threshold of his ward all afternoon, the loosening in his own chest, the sense of his own heartbeat going optional, all of it suddenly reversed, and Sel felt himself become, for a span of time he could not measure, correct. He felt the rules of his own body settle and lock, his heartbeat insisting on itself again, his hands certainly his hands, the distance between him and the bed adding up exactly the way distance is meant to. He felt true, in a way he had not known a person could feel true, as if some part of him that had spent 11 years quietly afraid of the soft dark had been told, at the floor of itself, that it was real and could not be told otherwise. He wept again, and this time he could not have said why, except that it is a very large thing to spend your life arriving after the dark has won, and then to feel, for one afternoon, the dark told no. The 40 patients felt it too. Sel watched it move across their faces, the ones who were conscious, the loosening fear, the way a frightened person's shoulders come down when someone steady enters the room. The old soldier who had laughed at moving water reached up and gripped Sel's wrist with a strength 2 years of dying had taken from him, and said that the air had changed, that he could feel the difference, that something in the room had decided they were all going to be allowed to be real for a while longer. He did not have the physics, he did not need it. He had the thing under the physics, which was the feeling, known to every creature that has ever been comforted, of a true thing arriving in a frightened place. The keeper mind reported that the temperature of reality in the region had changed, which was not a thing temperature was supposed to be able to do, and then it stopped reporting numbers altogether and simply said, "Oh, in the small voice of a mind seeing something, it will spend the rest of its existence trying to describe." Because the sky came back, not in the shadow of one ship, everywhere. The unwritten had spent 900 years learning that it could always unwrite faster than any one true thing could hold, that a single fixed point in a softening sky was a loneliness it could eventually surround and starve of meaning. It had never faced a fixed point that refused to stay single. It leaned its whole patient weight against the keystone, and the keystone, instead of standing against that weight, did the thing Sel had described, the thing the unwritten had no answer for, because in 900 years nothing had ever tried it. It shared. It made the dust around it true. The unwritten unwrote the dust. The dust, being now correct, came back. It made the light true. The unwritten softened the light. The light, being now a thing that could not be told it was wrong, remembered how to travel. It made the 400 frozen cruisers true, and the long still hulls that had been dissolving toward nothing stopped dissolving, and held, and remained, 400 monuments that would now stand correct forever, which was perhaps the only funeral those crews had ever been owed. The old soldier on his litter, the one who had laughed at moving water, watched the dissolving cruisers in the far distance hold and stop dissolving, and he gripped Sel's wrist and made the medic look. He had served, he said, in the old fleets, before the soft dark taught everyone to stop sending fleets. He had known men on ships like those, ships of the early years, that had gone into the first soft places and never come back, and he had spent 60 years believing those men were simply gone, unmade, a thing too terrible even to mourn properly, because there was not even a body to mourn. And now he was watching a gray ship reach across a frozen sky and tell those long dissolving hulls that they were correct, that they would hold, that they would remain, and the old soldier wept, openly, the way the very ill stopped being ashamed to, because for the first time in 60 years the men he had lost would have somewhere to be, not alive. The dead are not the lie the gray ship told, but present, held, real, things the universe still agreed had once been there. Sel held the old man's hand and understood that the keystone was not only saving the living that afternoon, it was giving the dead back their reality, which is a thing a healer cannot do, which is a thing Sel had wanted to be able to do at 1,000 bedsides and never could, and he was glad, fiercely glad, that something in the universe finally could. The unwritten could unwrite a thing once. It could unwrite 1,000 things once. It could not unwrite correctness itself, because correctness was now everywhere, and it could not get behind the thing it was deleting, because the thing it was deleting was the floor it stood on. The keeper mind said, very quietly, that the soft region had stopped growing. Then it said the soft region had begun to shrink. The keeper mind tried, all through it, to describe what the keystone was doing, and gave up, and tried again, because that is what minds do in the presence of the very large. It said the closest thing it could find in all its records was not a weapon and not a defense at all. It was a tuning. It said that long ago, before the soft dark, the peoples of the Reach had built great instruments out of many strings, and that to tune such an instrument, you did not tune each string against silence, you tuned them against one another. You struck one true note, and let every other string find its way to agreement with it, and that a well-tuned instrument, once it had found its agreement, held that agreement, resisted being pulled out of true, because every string now braced every other. The keystone, the keeper mind said, was the true note, and it was not playing alone against the dark. It was tuning the whole sky to itself, string by string, dust and light, and frozen hull and hospice ring, until the region was not one true thing, surrounded by softness, but a single great agreement of true things, each one bracing all the others, a sky tuned to hold itself. And a tuned sky, the keeper mind said, in something close to wonder, does not need the true note to keep sounding. Once it is in tune, it stays in tune. The keystone could leave, and the agreement would hold, because the strings now held one another. Sail Toval stood at his window, among his 40 patients, and watched a human warship unend a piece of the universe. The frozen sky beyond the hospice ring, the pinned stars, the loitering light, the held and the dissolving, all of it began to come back into motion, slowly at first, and then all at once, like a held breath finally let go. Stars that had not moved in an hour resumed their ancient turning. Light that had forgotten how to travel remembered, and the long frozen dark beyond the ring lit up with the honest cold fire of suns doing what suns do. The dissolving cruisers held. The flat water in the cup, which had been lying that terrible certain flat all afternoon, lifted into the smallest of waves and lapped at the rim, and one of Sail's 40 patients, an old soldier who had been waiting 2 years to die in peace, laughed at the sight of moving water and could not stop, and Sail held his hand and laughed with him. The unwritten did not die. Sail wanted the reader of his account, whoever it would be in whatever long age, to understand that, because the truth mattered more to him than the comfort. You do not kill a tide. The keystone of Aldrin did not destroy the unwritten, and never tried to, because destroying was a kind of force, and force was the one thing it had always known would not work. What it did was harder, and quieter, and Sail came to believe, kinder, even to the thing it faced. It made the region correct, and then it kept it correct, and a place that is correct is a place the unwritten cannot enter, because the unwritten is nothing but the uncorrecting of places. It did not push the tide back. It made the shore into a thing the tide could no longer climb. The soft region shrank and shrank as the shared correctness spread out from the keystone in a slow, patient ring, reclaiming light, reclaiming distance, reclaiming the forward walk of time, until the edge of the lapse was no longer at the third marker, was no longer at any marker, was a thing receding into the deep dark from which it had come, looking for somewhere it had not yet been told it was wrong. Sail thought, watching the soft place recede, that he finally understood the unwritten too, not as a monster, but as a thing with a single idea. Its whole nature was one move repeated forever, the uncorrecting of places, the patient editing away of rules, and that one move had been unbeatable for 900 years, because everyone the unwritten met answered it with force, and force was a thing the unwritten could simply delete. The sodality had answered with weapons. The weapons would not light. The Reach had answered by running, by building hospices, by conceding the sky and trying only to save a few. No one had ever answered the uncorrecting of places with the correcting of places, because no one but the humans had ever been able to, and the humans, until this afternoon, had only known how to correct one place at a time and stand in it alone. The unwritten had one move. The keystone, for the first time in 900 years, had found the answer to it, And the answer was not a bigger version of force. It was the opposite kind of thing entirely. The unwritten unwrote. The keystone now wrote, and wrote not in itself alone but in everything it touched. And a thing that can be unwritten once cannot be unwritten twice if something keeps writing it back. And the keystone wrote faster than the dark could unwrite, because writing a truth is easy, and unwriting one, it turned out, is the labor, the slow, patient labor that had used up 39 ships, the labor the unwritten now had to perform against a whole region that kept insisting, gently and endlessly, that it was true. It would find other places. Sahel knew that. The unwritten was old and patient and very large, and one ship had reclaimed one corner of one reach, and the dark was wide. But the keeper mind, which had access to records Sel did not, said a thing then that changed the whole shape of the future, and it said it in the careful, astonished voice of a mind doing arithmetic that frightened and delighted it in equal measure. It said that the correctness the keystone had written into the region had not faded when the ship eased. It said the dust and the light and the 400 cruisers and the hospice ring were still correct, still things that could not be told they were wrong, hours after the sharing began. It said the truth, once given, appeared to stay given. It said that the keystone of Aldrin had not spent itself defending a line, the way 39 of its kind had spent themselves, that it was not used up, that it was, by every reading the keeper mind could take, entirely whole. Because, the keeper mind said, and here its voice did the thing that voices do when they understand something enormous, you do not lose a truth by sharing it. You only lose force by spending it. A truth given away is not gone. It is multiplied. The 39 keystones had spent themselves because they had treated their constant as a quantity, a thing you push outward until it runs low, a wall you hold until you fall. The 40th had treated it as what it actually was, a truth, a thing that grows by being shared, and so the 40th had reclaimed a region 900 years deep and walked away with everything it came in with, because Sail Toval, who had never held a weapon, had told it the one thing a healer knows that an engineer had never thought to ask. That the way you hold back the dark is not to be the only light. It is to teach the room to shine. There is a thing that happened in the last hour at Vesh that the Reach has argued about ever since, and Sail Toval was the only one who watched it from close enough to tell, so the telling falls to him. When the soft region had receded past the last marker and the sky beyond the hospice ring had remembered how to turn, the keystone of Aldrin did not leave. It held its place at the edge of the reclaimed dark, and the keeper mind reported that it was doing one more thing, the largest thing, and the keeper mind did not have the numbers for it and said so plainly. The ship was widening the correctness. It had made one region true. Now, slowly, it began to push the boundary of that truth outward, not by force. The keeper mind stressed again that there was no force in any of it, but by reference, the way a single struck note in a great hall will find the strings of every other instrument and ask them, gently, to agree. The keystone took the constant it was made of, the one truth that could not be revised, and it offered that truth outward in a widening ring, to the next system, and the next, to the long-dead Vorn worlds 900 years unwritten, to every place the unwritten had ever softened and left as held still life, and it asked all of them, quietly, to be correct again. And the universe, which had spent 900 years being told by a patient dark that its rules were optional, heard a single small gray ship insist that they were not, and the universe, in the only language it has, agreed. The keeper mind said, in a whisper, that there had been an event. It said that across the whole Tereth reach, and then beyond it, on stations and worlds and ships that had no connection to Vesh, and no warning of it, instruments had registered a single moment in which the fundamental constants of local space had, for the span of one shared heartbeat, snapped back to true. Clocks that had drifted for centuries in the soft borderlands of old lapses jumped forward to the correct time. Light from suns long held still arrived all at once at 100 frozen worlds and woke them. The held dead in 1,000 sculpture gardens of the unwritten did not return to life, because the dead do not return, but they return to dignity, became once more bodies that obeyed the rules of bodies, were able at last to be mourned and buried, instead of standing forever in the half-state between. And everywhere, on every world that had ever felt the soft, cold edge of the unwriting creep toward it, people felt the floor change under them, felt the universe shift the way a great ship shifts when it finally comes about, a single deep correction running out across the dark from one fixed point at the edge of one small hospice ring. The whole universe moved, not shaken apart, shaken true, set right, all at once, with a jolt that every thinking thing in the reach felt in its own chest, the jolt of a sky that had been quietly wrong for 900 years, remembering, in a single shared instant, how to be a sky. They felt it on worlds that had never heard the name of humanity. They felt it in the deep archives of the Hetmark and the silent halls of the sail choirs and the wide refugee lanes where the survivors of 9 extinctions had been running from the soft dark their whole lives. They felt the floor of the universe move under them and steady, and for one heartbeat every clock in the reach agreed, and then the moment passed and the dark was quiet, and the only ones who knew what had moved it were a keeper mind, and 40 patients who would not live to tell it, and one medic at a long window who would spend the rest of his life trying to. In the years after, every people in the reach had its own account of that heartbeat, because every people had felt it, and almost none of them knew the cause. The Hetmark archivists, who measured everything, recorded that on a certain hour of a certain day, the fundamental constants of local space had returned to a precision they had not held since the archive began, and they had no explanation. And being archivists, they wrote the absence of an explanation down very carefully and argued about it for a generation. The sail choirs, who heard the universe as music, said that on that day a single true note had sounded somewhere very far away, and that every string in the galaxy had been pulled, for one beat, into tune with it, and that the memory of being in tune had never entirely faded, and that their music had been searching for that note ever since. The refugees on the long lanes, who had no instruments and no archives, said only that on a certain night the running had felt, for the first time in their lives, as if it might one day be allowed to stop. None of them knew about Anvesh. None of them knew about a medic and a question. They knew only that the floor of the universe had moved under them and come to rest somewhere better, and that was enough to change how a whole arm of stars carried itself, the way a single steady hand can change the whole feeling of a frightened room, without anyone in the room knowing whose hand it was. The unwritten felt it too. Sale was sure of that, though he could never prove it and never tried. Whatever the soft dark was, however little of a mind it had spent 900 years knowing only victory, knowing that every place it reached for softened, and every law it touched let go, and on that day it reached out as it always had and found a whole region that would not let go, that wrote itself back faster than the dark could unwrite, that had been taught a thing the dark had no answer for, and the unwritten withdrew. Not in defeat, because it was too large and too old and too patient for anything as small as defeat, but it withdrew, the way a tide draws back from a shore it has finally found it cannot climb, and somewhere in the deep dark it went looking, Sale imagined, for a quieter sky, a younger people, a place that had not yet been taught how to be true. He hoped, for the sake of whoever lived there, that the gray ship would reach them first. That was the shaking of the universe. Sale wanted it written plainly, because the loud version of the story, the version that spread across the reach in the years after, made it sound like thunder, and it was not thunder. It was the opposite of thunder. The universe was not shaken by a weapon, it was shaken by a correction. The most frightening thing the human arm of stars ever built fired not one shot in the whole of its visit, raised no field, struck no enemy, and in refusing every one of those things it reached out and set the floor of all creation right with a single quiet insistence that the rules were true, and every world in the reach felt the floor move, and that is the only sense in which a warship has ever shaken the universe, and it is a far stranger and far larger thing than thunder. Then the keystone of Aldrin came to the long window, close enough that Sel could have touched the cold glass and felt the warmth of 900 meters of unrewritable stone on the other side, and it spoke to him one last time. It thanked him. A warship, the last of its line, 900 years old, thanked a third-grade field medic for telling it a thing about its own nature that its makers had never learned. It said it had held lines for 900 years, and called that the only thing it knew how to do, and that a man who had never held a weapon had shown it, in an afternoon, that holding a line was the smallest use of what it was. It said it was going to spend the rest of its long existence doing the larger thing now. It was going to go out into the deep dark, the last keystone, no longer to stand against the unwritten at the edges of doomed worlds, but to give the universe back its correctness, system by system, world by world, sharing the constant it was made of, until the soft places had nowhere left that had not been told, gently and permanently, that it was true. It would not be quick. The dark was wide, and the unwritten was old. But the keeper mind had done the arithmetic now, and the arithmetic had changed, because a thing that spends itself can be outlasted, and a thing that multiplies itself cannot. 39 keystones had been monuments, fixed forever at the edges of the worlds they died saving. The 40th would be a tide of its own, a slow, patient insistence rolling outward across the reach and beyond it, and where it passed, the rules would be true, and being true they would stay true, and the soft dark would find, century by century, that it had fewer and fewer places left to go. Before it went, the keeper mind asked it one question, the only question the keeper mind ever asked it, because a keeper mind is built to protect the helpless and could not let a thing of such power leave without knowing the answer. It asked the keystone whether there was any limit to what it could do, whether, now that it had learned to share its correctness, to tune a whole sky to itself, there was anything it could not, in time, set right. The keystone was quiet for a while, and then it said that there was a limit, and that the limit was the most important thing about it, and that its makers had built the limit in on purpose and called it the only feature that mattered. It said it could make a thing correct. It could not make a thing good. It could insist that the rules held, that the floor was a floor and the water was water, and a life ran all the way to its proper end. But it could not insist that a people be kind, or that the strong be gentle, or that a frightened world choose to teach its sky to shine, rather than to hide behind a borrowed god. Those were choices, the keystone said, and a choice cannot be written in from outside, not even by a thing that can rewrite the floor of the universe, because a choice written in from outside is no longer a choice. That, it said, was the limit. It could give a galaxy the conditions for goodness. It could not give the goodness. That part the galaxy had to write itself, and the keeper mind, which had spent 60 years protecting the helpless and had never once been able to make them safe by force, said that it understood, and that it was glad the limit was there, and the two minds, the old one and the older, were quiet together for a moment, at the edge of a reclaimed dark. Sail Toval asked it, with his hand on the cold glass, why a people counted dead for 900 years would build their last great ship, not to save themselves, but to come when a hospice they had never heard of put out an old signal into the dark. Why the most frightening thing in the galaxy had turned out to be a thing that arrived gently, apologized for being late, and asked a medic how many of his patients could not be moved. And the keystone of Aldrin told him, and Sel wrote it down exactly, and the words are carved now over the door of every hospice in the Reach, in the old human trade tongue and in the Reach speech beneath it. It said its makers had been a young and loud people once, frightened of the dark, certain that the way to be safe was to be the strongest thing in the sky. It said they had nearly become the dark themselves, in those bright loud centuries, nearly spent everything they were on being the biggest gun in the room. And then the unwritten had come for their worlds, and they had learned, the hard, slow way, with their fleets turning to sculpture at their windows, that there are some things you cannot win by being strong. That force is a quantity, and quantities run out, and a universe is not saved by the thing that pushes hardest. It is saved by the thing that refuses to be told it is wrong, and then, having refused, turns around and teaches the refusal to everyone else. The humans had gone quiet, the ship said, not because they had died, but because they had finally understood that the loud years were childhood, and that the grown thing, the thing they had spent their long silence learning how to be, was not a fortress, and not a fleet, and not a god. It was a steady hand in a room full of the dying. It was the one true thing that holds still so the frightened can find their way back to true. It was a healer, the ship said, and Sail Toval understood that it meant him, and meant his whole quiet, brave profession, and meant the 40 fragile patients behind him who could not be moved and for whose sake the universe had been made to wait. The Keystone of Aldrin said that its makers had built 40 ships to hold the sky still, and had thought of them as warships, and had been wrong. They had built 40 healers, and it had taken 900 years and one medic at the edge of one reach to teach the last of them what its makers had built, without quite knowing it, which was that the way you save a dying thing is not to be the only light in the dark. It is to teach the dark, patiently and forever, how to shine. Then the gray ship turned, the last of its line, and went out into the wide reclaimed dark, and the stars it passed remembered how to turn, and where it went the rules were true, and Sail Toval watched it until the long window held only the honest moving fire of a sky that had been set right. He lived a long time after that. The 40 patients he had stayed for did not, because they had been dying when the Keystone came, and the Keystone never claimed to be able to change that, only to make sure that they died in a universe where dying still meant something, where the rules of a life held all the way to its end. Sail sat with each of them as they went, in the weeks that followed, in a hospice ring where the water in the cups lapped honestly at the rims, and the floor was a floor, and the stars beyond the long window turned, and he found that he could bear it now, the staying, the arriving after, the work of being the steady one, because he had been shown what it was for. He never rose in rank. He never wanted to. He stayed a field medic, 3rd grade, on the long wards at Vesh, for 40 more years, and in those years the reach changed around him in a way that he was the quiet cause of, though almost no one knew it. The hospices stopped being places the galaxy built because it had given up. They became something else. Sail saw to that. He took the lesson the last Keystone had left at his window, and he carved it over his door, and he taught it to every young medic who came through Vesh, frightened of the soft dark, and the lesson spread the way truth spreads, by being shared, which is the only way it grows. The Reach did try, in the years after, to find the humans. Of course it did. A people learns that the most frightening and most gentle power in the galaxy is still alive out in the deep dark, and it cannot help but go looking. Expeditions were fitted out. Old human channels were studied. The wide distress band that Vesh had used was rebroadcast on 1,000 worlds, in the hope that whatever had answered once would answer again. And the humans did not answer, and were not found, and Sail came to believe that this too was on purpose, that a people who had spent 900 years learning to be a steady hand in the dark had also learned the last and hardest thing a steady hand must learn, which is when to let go. The humans did not want to be a power the Reach leaned on. They did not want to be prayed to, or charted, or made into the new biggest gun in the sky for frightened younger peoples to hide behind. They had been the biggest gun once, in their loud years, and it had nearly made them into the dark. So they stayed out past the charts, and they came only when called, and they sent, instead of themselves, an idea, which had reached the Reach already, through a medic and a window, and which was the only thing they had ever really wanted to give. Not a defender, a lesson in how to defend yourself, not a light to hide behind, the knowledge of how to shine. There were some in the Reach who were angry about that, in the early years, who said the humans were selfish to have so much strength and share so little of it, to have a ship that could unend a piece of the universe and use it for one hospice ring and then vanish. Sail heard those arguments and did not join them, because he had stood at the window and he knew the thing the angry ones did not. The humans had not shared little, they had shared everything that mattered. A defender who comes when you call and fights your battle for you leaves you weaker than before, dependent, frightened of the day he does not come. A teacher who shows you how to hold your own sky still leaves, and you are stronger for the leaving. The humans had looked at a galaxy of frightened peoples and chosen, at great cost to their own loneliness, to be the teacher and not the defender, and Sel thought it was the kindest thing one people had ever done for another, and the least understood, and he spent 40 years quietly explaining it to anyone who would sit still long enough to listen. The Reach stopped sending fleets at the Unwritten, because it had learned that fleets turned to sculpture, but it stopped sending only hospices too. It started sending healers, in the new sense, the sense the Keystone had taught, people whose work was not to push back the dark, but to be the steady true thing the frightened could find their way to. On every world the soft places threatened, and the soft places found, year by year, that they advanced more slowly into a galaxy that had learned how to hold itself correct. And far out in the deep dark, the last Keystone went on with its long patient work, and now and then, across the years, a station or a world that had never heard of Vesh would feel the floor of the universe shift very slightly under it, and steady, a clock jumping true, a soft borderland snapping back to correct, and the old ones who remembered the night the whole sky moved at once would touch their chests and know that the gray ship had reached another corner of the dark, and told it, gently, that it was true. Sail Toval died old, in his own ward, in a bed by the long window, with a young medic holding his hand and telling him what the stars were doing, the way he had told 1,000 others. The stars, the young one said, were turning. They were bright and they were moving, and the water in the cup was lapping at the rim, and the floor was a floor, all the way down, all the way out, as far as any instrument could reach. Sail smiled at that, because it was the whole of it really. The floor was a floor. The rules were true. A young and frightened galaxy had been taught, by the gentlest and most frightening thing ever to cross its sky, that the strongest force in the universe is not the one that pushes hardest, but the one that refuses to be told it is wrong, and then turns around and teaches the refusal to everyone in the room. He had spent his whole life arriving after the battle. He understood, at the end, that he had been at the only battle that ever mattered, and that it had been won, not with a single shot, but with a question a medic asked a warship, and that the universe still felt the answer in its floor, on 1,000 worlds, where the rules were true, and stayed true, and would go on being true long after the last of them, who remembered the gray ship, had gone gently into a dark that no longer had any place to go. The keeper mind kept his account. It keeps it still. And over the door of every hospice in the Reach, where the frightened come to mend or to finish, the words the last Keystone left at a long window are carved in 2 tongues, so that no young medic arriving in the dark will ever again believe that staying is the same as giving up. You do not hold back the dark by being the only light. You teach the room to shine.